So we will be this morning in Galatians chapter 5. We'll look at the fruit of the Spirit. We will this evening, ironically enough, be talking about one of the pieces of the fruit of the Spirit, patience. And I was laughing to myself as Jared started to teach this morning, and I thought, I got to pay close attention to make sure I don't say the same thing Jared said. But God must really want us to have patience, Jared, because there was a lot of what you were saying. I thought, as Jared was describing that vacation, I thought, I've had vacations just like that, where I had in mind we need to be at this place around the time they open, and I just sit there waiting and waiting. And I have that same problem where I think I'm controlling it pretty well, and apparently my facial expressions don't come along with me for the control. And so we'll talk more about patience tonight, and much like Jared, who probably felt ill-equipped for that this morning, I feel ill-equipped tonight, but we'll try to patiently work through it together. But this morning we'll talk about the fruit of the Spirit, but we will begin with context. I think it's very helpful, especially with this topic. So we'll begin in verse 1 of Galatians chapter 5. And we'll look as we start at verse 1 and verse 13 that are kind of related to one another. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, Paul says, "For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." For in verse 13, "For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." Now, I think it's pretty clear what Paul is trying to get through to us here is this idea of freedom. As I sat in my bed trying to stay away from everybody else in my house for the last couple weeks now, it seems like, I was watching far too much television. And I was looking through the guide one day, and I saw Braveheart near the close of Braveheart was on. And I thought, I don't want to trudge through 3 hours of Braveheart, but the last 15 minutes I'll go for. And so I clicked over to Braveheart, and I got there just in time, spoiler alert for a 25-year-old movie, I got there just in time to find William Wallace there on the rack, about to be tortured, and the guy who is doing the torture is just trying to get him to say mercy, and he won't do it. And finally he gets to the point where you could see he's trying to muster a word to say, and I think the guy expects that it's going to be mercy, and then he yells out with his last breath, "Freedom." And that whole movie is kind of this story of just the desire for freedom. For him, it was freedom from the British, but for us, we understand this idea of freedom. In the verse 1 there, the noun and the verb are both freedom. It's talking about freeing us for freedom. And then when we get to verse 13, this idea is repeated again of the importance of freedom. Now, what we struggle with because of the world in which we live, and especially of the culture in which we live in America, is what do we think of when we think of freedom? I think we've seen that unfold quite a bit over the last couple weeks. Freedom is all about my rights, isn't it? It's all about, I'm going to have things my way, in my timing, and let the chips fall where they may, and you can deal with it, and we celebrate that idea. We celebrated that idea as I was there isolated in my house. For many days of fireworks, I've decided that July 4th on a Monday is the worst option because they're doing them all weekend long. My dog hates fireworks, and we were just going through all of that. But it's a celebration of freedom. We think of freedom in a Christian sense. What is it a celebration of? Is it a celebration of my rights? Is it a celebration of individualism and all of those things? Or is it a celebration of the fact that God has freed us to do the right thing, to obey, to live in the right way, which in an American sense doesn't sound like freedom. It sounds like the thing we fight against, but yet that is what God has freed us for. So Paul continues on in verse 14. "The whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." So within this freedom, there's an awful lot of one another. The way I heard this explained in an American sense when I was a kid is my freedom to swing my fist ends where your face begins. I'm no longer free just to swing around. I learned this, by the way, I may have told the story before. I learned this the hard way as a first grader. I remember it very well. It was the first time I was sent to the office. I was, at the end of the school day, standing in line, Star Wars metal lunchbox in hand, X-Wing fighter on the front of it. You may have had that lunchbox if you're my age. And I was no care in the world. The school day was over. I was excited about going home, playing baseball in the backyard, all of that stuff. And I was swinging my lunchbox along, ready to go. What I didn't know was Kim, who was standing in line behind me, was about to bend down and tie her shoe. and I was swinging the lunchbox, no care in the world, and all of a sudden I felt resistance to the lunchbox and a loud thud as I had hit Kim square in the nose with my metal Star Wars lunchbox. And I turned around to the horror of Kim crying and blood on the floor. And I was sent to the office for hitting Kim in the nose, because that's all the teacher saw. And I got to the office, and I was beside myself. I'd never been in trouble before. I didn't know what to do. And I was there in the midst of this, and I realized, my freedom to swing the lunchbox is not all I thought it was. And I got in a lot of trouble that day, and they finally figured out what had happened, and I got in a little less trouble, but it was still kind of a pretty rough day. The freedom that we live with as Christians is a freedom to be the right way with one another. It is a freedom that says, I care so much about you and how my life affects your life that I'm going to adjust when I need to adjust. I'm going to not necessarily think of things in terms of this is what I want, but I'm going to think of things in terms of how can we harmonize together? How can we get along with one another? And so Paul says you have this freedom, but this freedom comes with a responsibility for how you are with one another. And then he says, but I say, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So what he's going to ask us here is this question of, are you going to live by flesh or are you going to live by Spirit? And this is, by the way, the struggle that people have had all the way back to the Garden of Eden. We read about this man that is created and the breath of life is breathed into his nostrils. Literally, the Spirit, it's the same Hebrew word, is breathed into his nostrils. And then from that point forward, it becomes a battle of, am I going to be with the Spirit or with the flesh? And he gets this temptation early on about, well, you can be like God if you eat this fruit that you're not supposed to have, and he chooses flesh. And then we watch through Scripture as people over and over and over again, they choose flesh. Why? It's right in front of us. It's appealing. It's whatever it may be. We choose the things of the flesh often. And before you think to yourself, well, not me. I'm above that. I've left all that stuff behind. There is something for you. I don't know what it is, but there is a place where what you want in the flesh wins out over the Spirit. If you have the NIV here, by the way, you have this sinful nature and spirit idea. It's the same thing. The flesh comes back to, what do we want as people? What do we want here that is earthly, physical, worldly? And so he goes on to explain a little about what this is. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. So they're the things that you want to do. Now, I like that Paul here gives us the benefit of the doubt. Because as you read this, his assumption is the things we want to do are the things of the Spirit. Although it seems a little too often like the things we want to do are the things of the flesh, aren't they? And these two, by the way, he says are in opposition to one another. You have to follow one or the other. It's the same language Jesus would choose when he says, you cannot serve God and money. You got to choose one or the other. It's not possible to do both at the same time. And so Paul says these things, they're going to be in opposition. And when you want to do the right thing and you don't, it is that flesh that is getting through. And I like to think that if we knew what it was before it was coming, we would find a way to stop it. But too often we just find ourselves falling back into that same thing again. How many times have you found yourself praying to overcome something that you have already prayed to overcome and thought you would overcome? How many times have you found yourself saying, I will never do this again? And then you find yourself doing that again. We all struggle with different things. And Paul says this is the flesh and the Spirit fighting against each other. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. So we want to be people who are led by the Spirit. You probably can think of different times in life where you have been led by someone who knows more than you, who is more familiar with whatever is going on than you. I think so many times as a child, as you may have been led along by the hand, kept away from danger as you go. We were walking through the park yesterday morning with our dog, trying to get some energy out of our dog because she gets kind of listless at night and wants to dig and chew and all kinds of things. We thought, well, let's wear her down this morning. And as we're walking around there, she's on a leash, and the leash is for a number of things. It's, so if you walk along, our dog doesn't attack you or anything, but it's also to try to keep her out of danger. We're leading her in the way that she needs to go. Are we willing to be led by the Spirit in that way? in a way that says, I acknowledge you know better than I do. I acknowledge that as much as I think I've got things figured out, I don't have things fully figured out. And so I want to be led by the Spirit in the things that I do. So now the works of the flesh are evident. I want you to look at the different works of the flesh as he describes them here. First of all, he says, they're evident: sexual immorality, impurity, and sensuality. So first of all, as we give into the works of the flesh, there are things of a sexual nature that tend to take over people's desires, over people's minds, and I think we can see that pretty clearly in our world. So many of the arguments we have as a world about freedom and different things like that are where these designs of the sexual nature that God has made are taken in a direction that God did not intend for them to go. And so as we begin to give in the flesh, this is one of the ways that shows itself. And then he says, in idolatry and sorcery. Now, idolatry and sorcery are probably not things that we think of as big issues in our lives a whole lot. Our big sorcery argument is what you think about Harry Potter and things like that. You know, none of us are going out to do witchcraft or anything like that. But that is a struggle within our world. But idolatry, even though it's not us making graven images and bowing down, there are a lot of things in our lives that become idols. And so as the sexual things are part of the nature of the flesh, there's also this piece of the flesh that is, we're going to mess up how we do religion. And so the religion is going to become more about how I want things to be, not about trying to honor God, about how He wants things to be. And again, if you don't believe this is a problem, think about all the church split stories that you have heard over the course of time. Are they about doing God things the right way, or are they about the way that people want things? And I will tell you that about 9 times out of 10, they have nothing to do with God and everything to do with how people want things. We want it done this way and in this timing and everything else, and so we will divide because of those things. And then he continues on with enmity and strife and jealousy and fits of anger. So these are things that have to do with all that one another he's been talking about, but these are the actions that we take out on each other. They begin in attitudes, and then they kind of take root in what we do. And so we, all the way down to, as he describes here at the end, fits of anger. We just lash out at one another. And think of how many times you have witnessed that, how many times you've been on the wrong side of that, or maybe even now, every now and then, you've done that yourself. You find yourself in a place where you don't like the way someone else is doing something, and then you lash out and you react because of that. You're frustrated, you're upset, whatever it may be, and you begin to act differently. And then there are rivalries and dissensions and divisions and envy. So as we have these attitudes that then begin to take action, this is how they affect the relationship. They affect the relationship in such a way that everything becomes a battle. Everything becomes a contest. And then we have these divisions among us, these dissensions among us, and then we begin to dislike each other because of the status or the things that we have. He continues on in verse 21. In drunkenness and in orgies. And by the way, one of these words has a little more weight culturally now than it did here. When he says orgies here in this context, what he's talking about, revelry is one of the possible ways that this is interpreted. It's the idea of just a lifestyle. It's not a sexual thing. It has to do with drinking and substance abuse and all of those kinds of things. And so sometimes these sins, this desire of the flesh, takes root in what are the addictions that we have. And so people tend to take root in something other than God. They spend their time and their money and their energy all in something other than God. And then he says, just to kind of encompass it all, if you think, well, you know, I feel good, I haven't really given in any of these other things, and stuff like this. There is something like this that is of the flesh. Let's not even get into gluttony or anything like that. But there are things of the flesh that we tend to give into. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So he gives us this warning. And I would like to think that anywhere in Scripture that a warning is given to us that if you do this, you're not going to inherit the kingdom. That's pretty significant. And yet as you look back through that list, how many times have we seen ourselves or people around us fall into the desires of the flesh? Because they're here and they're in front of us and they're obvious, and man, they look enticing, don't they? Think about the way you see these things advertised on television. I always enjoy watching the Super Bowl, half because of the Super Bowl and half because of all the ads. And sometimes they're funny and sometimes they're thought-provoking or whatever it may be. But think about the beer ads that you will see during the Super Bowl. What are they trying to sell you? Are they really trying to explain to you, this is how beer tastes? This is the benefit you will get from beer just from a nutritional standpoint? Or are they trying to sell you, this is what your life could be like if only you could have this thing? And somewhere along the way, it extended past beer. Do you remember long ago when a car ad used to talk about what the car did? A car ad was all about horsepower, and you would see them like sliding around corners, and they would talk about handling and all of these things. And now it's about, this is what your life will be like if you have this car. This is about what your life will be like if you wear these things, go to this place, do this stuff. And we're sold all of these things around us, and Paul says, let me give you a warning. If your life is all about the stuff, all about the things, you're not going to inherit the kingdom. Because all of those things, they go away. All of those things you thought were so important at some point, they're all temporary. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things, there is no law. And so what he tells us is you have works and you have fruit. And you have to choose one or the other. You have these works that are of flesh, all of these different things, and then you have fruit of the Spirit. And notice, by the way, here, I know in English, fruit or fruits, I think fruit is actually more proper when you're giving the plural. The fruit here is singular within the Greek. There is fruit of the Spirit. We have been guilty many times, I think, of thinking, okay, here's this list of 8 things. I do one of these really well. I do 3 of these pretty good. I'm working on 2 of them, and 2 of them will likely just remain out of reach for me. Yeah, I think of Jared talking about patience this morning. Man, if I could ever get patience down, I think I would feel pretty good about things. It always feels just a little out of reach for me. But it's fruit of the Spirit. I hate to tell you this, and I hate to tell me this. We're called to do all of this. But even more than that, we're not called to do all of this. We're called to be all of this. Notice these things he talks about. It's the works of the Spirit. It's all these things that we do. The works of the flesh, all of these things that we do. But it's the fruit of the Spirit. And all the things he describes, they're attitudes. They're ways of being. It's not like, hey, I'm going to go do some patience today. I'm going to go do some gentleness or some goodness today. We're going to be patient, good, and gentle people. All of these things are going to show in our lives because we are people of God living with the Spirit within us. So how does healthy fruit grow? You may not know this. I learned this in botany. I mentioned to you somewhere long, long ago. I went to college to be pre-med. And I had to take a botany class as a biochemistry major. I had to take a botany class. I had no desire to take a botany class. Trees and flowers are out there. That's all good with me. I don't really care. They're fun to look at and all of that, but I don't care about that. And I was shocked about midway through the botany class that it's kind of interesting. I didn't really understand all of this about, and I can even now, as many years later as it's been, every now and then I can get a leaf right. If I see it on a tree, I remember that from botany class. One of the things I learned in botany class is that a tree that bears fruit, the point is actually not you and I eating the fruit, although a lot of us like that, some of us more than others. The point is not the eating of the fruit. The whole point of the fruit is to make more trees. If that apple tree or pear tree or orange tree or whatever it may be is just out there all by itself and no people are around, what happens is that fruit will fall to the ground and rot, and there in the midst of that are the seeds that will then go into the ground under that dead fruit and grow more trees. The whole point of the fruit is growing more. And so fruit is designed to grow. So it's not an accident, first of all, that Paul chooses the word fruit in its singular, because we're to be all of these things. But secondly, it's not an accident because all of these things should not look in your life exactly like they did the day you came up out of the water. They should be different. You should be, because of the presence of the Spirit in you, much more patient than you used to be. You should be much more good and kind and gentle than you used to be. And I'm realize I'm doing this midway through. We should be much more patient and kind and gentle than we used to be. It's not just you, it's me too. We are called to be these things because the Spirit is living within us, and that is the fruit that's going to come out from Him. So how does healthy fruit grow? I feel like one of the best answers I've read to this is in Tim Keller's book, Galatians for You. He goes through the book of Galatians. I believe I shared these with you when we went through Galatians on Wednesday evenings back in February of last year, but I think they're worth looking at again, especially for those who weren't here. How does healthy fruit grow? First of all, growth is gradual. We could, if we would like to, get some seeds for an apple tree and go plant them in our backyards today. I have no idea how apple trees grow in Oklahoma, by the way. My guess is it's probably not choice number one in Oklahoma, but maybe they work. We could go plant those in our backyard today. We could water it, get all the soil just right. If you get up tomorrow morning looking for apples, you're going to be sadly disappointed. And my guess is if you get up a week later looking for apples and a couple weeks later, you're going to be disappointed. I remember growing up in South Alabama, my family ate a lot of watermelon. And there was one time I thought, I'm going to take some of these watermelon seeds and I'm going to go plant watermelon in the backyard. I was a kid, and I dug a hole and I planted the seeds in there. And I would go out there every day thinking, where are the watermelon? There's nothing here. And day after day after day, and then finally, I started to see a little sprout come up of something. I thought, that doesn't look like grass. That looks a little different. And then it got a little taller and a little taller. And then I went out probably about 2 weeks later, and my grandfather had mowed over all of it, and it was all gone, and I was sad. And then I went back out there a few weeks later, and sure enough, gradually I got a watermelon that looked like it was a lime or something. It wasn't right, but it was there. And I thought, hey, watermelon, it's gradual. If you think to yourself, because you liked Jared's lesson this morning, and it was life-changing, and you think, I'm going to be more patient, you are not going to fully figure out patient by the time you go to bed tonight. Now, hopefully, maybe you'll do things a little better than you did today or yesterday, but it will be a growing, gradual process. Secondly, growth is inevitable. Now, this is the one where I think we have convinced ourselves otherwise because we've seen too many examples of the opposite in our lives. Honestly, the fact that anything grew out of my watermelon seed is kind of surprising. We could probably do that more times and maybe it not work out at all. If the Spirit is within you, if the Spirit is part of the gift that you received as you were baptized into Christ and you come back out of the water in a new life, then it is inevitable that you will see these things in your life. They've got to come about, and we should be people who welcome them. Third, growth comes from internal roots. This is not a program you can join, a book you can read, a plan you can find. The growth like this comes from within. We have to be people who are changed on the inside for this to grow out. And so sure, can you read books about how to be more patient? You can read books about that. But until there is a heart change, you are not going to have the growth that you're looking for. And then fourth, growth is symmetrical, which I appreciate because I don't feel like I'm very symmetrical. But anyhow, this kind of growth there is fruit of the Spirit. So we should not be people who are lopsided in patience and completely empty of gentleness. We should be people who have gentleness and patience and kindness and goodness all growing out of us. All of those things are part of who we are. And if we are really, really good at one, you are likely just naturally gifted at that. And there's nothing wrong with that, and that's great. But we should be growing in all those other areas as well. In verse 23, it says, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Any kind of growth, we could add a fifth one from Keller's list. Any kind of growth we're going to have begins with death. That fruit has to die or be eaten for the next seeds to come out and something to begin to grow again. Whatever falls off of that tree dies, and then growth comes out of that. Our growth begins with a death to the old in the waters of baptism. And then we rise to this new life and grow in the way that God has designed us to grow. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Love this imagery. I think the last time we talked to this, I talked about marching band. I won't bore you with that again. But being in step with the Spirit is this. I noticed as we walked around Wintersmith Park yesterday with our dog that there were times where my wife walks faster than I do. I still have not figured that out because I think my legs are at least just a little bit longer, but she has always walked faster than me, and she's always kind of on a mission. And sometimes I feel like I'm just trying desperately to keep up. And so she a couple times actually was like, "Are you okay?" And I think she thought it was the COVID had taken root. And I was like, "No, I'm just slow. We're all good." And our dog, on the other hand, is faster than both of us. And she's trying to drag us ahead. And then there were occasional moments in the walk around Wintersmith. We were all kind of in a line going along. And I will tell you, those were the best parts of the walk. And maybe you've been there if you have kids or a pet or whatever, and they want to run and walk at different paces than you. You kind of feel like there's this time where everybody is together and everything feels just kind of right. That is the way the Spirit is designed to be within us. When we are living this out in the way that God has called us to live it, we are in step with Him. And I will tell you that I truly believe for people that kind of struggle to see the Spirit at times, I believe the times that you are in step with what He is doing are the times where you can see Him more clearly. If you think to yourself, I really struggle with seeing the Spirit at work in my life, if we are just to slow down or speed up a little bit, whatever it is we need to do to get where He's at, I think you will see His work a little bit more. And then he closes the chapter with this. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. I don't know what to do with this verse sometimes. There's a part of me that wants to tag this verse onto the next section. I will tell you, a lot of the commentaries, that's what they do, because it feels a little bit out of place with what we've just read. But I think Paul sees a little bit of human nature in us too here, which is the reminder that this is not a contest. It is not to see, well, who is the most patient among us? Who is more kind than I am? Or, well, at least I'm more gentle than she is. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. God has designed us all to live like this with one another, with the Spirit in our midst within us, to glorify Him, and so others can see Him more clearly. So this morning, is the fruit of the Spirit showing in your life? I hope, I really appreciated one of Jared's last points in class this morning. He talked about the need to be patient with ourselves. I hope you're not too hard on yourself and just assume, no, the fruit of the Spirit is not showing in my life. I think for most of us, there is some level of this that's pretty apparent to the people around you. Maybe you're hard on yourself and you don't see it, but I think there's some of this in there. But could it be showing more in your life? I think if we're honest with ourselves, probably so. There are probably things about the Spirit that need to work themselves more in how we live each day. So today, if you are not showing this fruit in your life, it's not a go read a self-help book and figure out how to be more good and more patient. But what it is to change from within. And if you have never changed from within, every new life begins with a death to the old way, a death to sin, a death to the way you have lived life, and to begin to rise and walk with Him again. That death comes through baptism. That resurrection comes through that same baptism because of the power of the Spirit within us. Or if you need to come back to Him because this is so much faded in your life, you just kind of feel like a dead tree out there. Know that that can be renewed and you can live once again. I heard a story this past week. I can't remember where I heard it, so if you heard it in the same place, sorry. But I heard the story this past week about someone had found some olive seeds in a cave somewhere in Israel, in the Holy Lands. These seeds were among things that had been found that were 2,000 years old. And they thought, wouldn't it be interesting to go plant these seeds and see what happens? And so they did. And would you believe that these 2,000-year-old seeds planted in the ground, cared for the same way that seeds you found yesterday would be, actually began to grow an olive tree? If you think to yourself, too far gone, I cannot be, God doesn't care about that. You are never too far gone. God can germinate in your life and bring growth out of you too. If there's some way we can help you to grow in Him and for the fruit of the Spirit to be shown in your life, please come while we stand and sing.